I'm going to start off with an invitation. Here's my invitation. I am the president of the program committee for the World Congress of Philosophy. You may not know this, but the last World Congress of Philosophy was actually in Beijing. And it was, how big was it? Well, it's twice the size of any other World Congress that's ever existed. There was something like 20,000 people there. They had it in a big hall. It was in the Olympic Hall. And one of the things that we started in Beijing was we decided that we'd have a student session. I'm humming. How do I stop the humming? Okay. That we'd have student sessions, which we had not done before in prior World Congresses. The World Congress of Philosophy meets every 5 years. And we decided to have student sessions for the first time, and the Chinese graduate students responded by submitting 1,000 proposals. So we had 1,000 sessions just of Chinese philosophy students. So the next World Congress was supposed to be in Melbourne, but it's moved to Rome. And when it first happened, I started apologizing to people. I apologized about having to leave Melbourne, Australia, for Rome, Italy. And people would stop me and say, I must be mishearing you. Are you apologizing about going to Rome instead of Melbourne? I said, yes. And they said, well, what's back? You got that backwards. We're happy to go to Rome. So if you want to go to Rome and you haven't been to Italy yet, please submit a paper. I promise you, if you submit a paper, by the way, Chinese, Mandarin is one of the official languages of the World Congress, so you could write the paper. I encourage you to write in English for one reason. If you write in English, I can guarantee a good audience for you, so that if you make mistakes or you want to learn more, find out who kindred spirits are, I can hook that up for you. If you write in Mandarin, you're on your own. Yeah, I can't help you much. But either way, you should come to Rome. If you come to Rome, you'll see lots of interesting speakers. We're anticipating about 10,000, about half the load of China, but 10,000 is still a lot of philosophers. And it's a pretty magic, if you haven't been to Rome, it's a pretty magical place. It'll be exciting. The mayor of Rome is so excited about the World Congress coming, he gave us $1 billion for organizing it. And he's going to open up all these archaeological sites which are closed to ordinary people, but open for us for evening sessions. There'll be performances. There'll be all sorts of exciting things. But the main thing I want to say to you is, if you submit a paper, I guarantee it'll get accepted, because I'll make sure it's accepted. Because any proposals that are submitted go through my eyes at some level or other. So please try to come. Oh, faculty, of course, that goes without saying. I was trying to get the students. They're the future. Sol Kripke used to say, when I talk to an audience, there are those who believe me, those who disbelieve me. I'm not talking to them. Why am I talking to people who believe me? And why am I going to talk to people who don't believe me? They're never going to believe me. It's the students. Those are the ones my target. That should be the target for most people, to try to change the minds of people before they've been fixed for eternity. I'm going to get into a little bit of philosophy of science here, which I didn't anticipate. But I'm beginning to realize that the debates that have been going on in philosophy, we're talking about some serious debates that involve important issues having to do with gender and race and sex and what's a woman, what's a family, what's a marriage. You know, you get people writing papers saying 2 men can't get married because it's analytically impossible. And so it says, well, what if we change the meaning? Well, you can't change the meaning. All those debates that are going on now among philosophers, particularly philosophers. One of the shocking things to me, which only occurred to me within the last few weeks, is that these debates took place already, a long time ago, with people like Feyerabend and Kuhn, scientific revolutions, debates that dominated discussions before my time in the 50s and 60s. I mean, Fudan, one of my colleagues who's since deceased, told me that when he was at MIT, he was very proud of the fact that MIT had the highest citation rate in the world of any philosophy department. I said, well, that's impressive. And he said, yep. He said, if we all died and we left Tom Kuhn behind, we'd still have the highest citation rate in the world. So the Kuhnian book, The Scientific Revolution, I actually like the Copernican Revolution one better, but 2 of the books by Thomas Kuhn, completely, they have like 1 million citations. If you took this whole room, probably would have 1 million citations together. So it's a very impressive fact. But I think the debates that are going on now about what is a woman, what is sex, what is gender, what is race, so those debates have a long history in philosophy of science. And that for some reason, although these are intelligent people, who they are in a short while, they didn't acknowledge this, or they didn't know. I'm assuming they didn't notice it. If you notice it, it's going to change the way you think about the debate. So let's go on from there. I'm going to do all the easy slides, and then I'm going to turn over to the smarter half of this team, Una, and let her do the hard stuff. So tradition. Are the slides up there? Do you know? Some on the slide called tradition. Successful communication requires joint grasp. So there's an old assumption in philosophy of language and philosophy of domain and in linguistic studies in general, and that is we're able to communicate because we share content. So if you think about John Locke, that's a long time ago, right, 17th century. John Locke had this picture of communication, which is your head is bubbling with ideas, and you want to share these ideas with your neighbor. How do you do that? Well, you encode these ideas in language. You send the code out. If the person knows how to decode, if he shares a coding system with you, he can decode the message and acquire your thought. He doesn't have to share it. He can just know what you're thinking. So that's sort of the standard. If you think about it, that's how communication is alleged to work in many quarters, that we have certain conventions that allow us to speak Mandarin or English or other languages. And because we share those languages, we can communicate with each other. I can say a sentence out loud, moving air molecules around. You can recover my thoughts and what I'm saying by virtue of being a competent speaker of the language. But the assumption, the fundamental part of this assumption is that without shared content, there could be no communication. That's the view that was being challenged for a long time, not just by people who were interested in heavy issues like sex and gender and stuff like that, but even philosophers, ordinary philosophy of language. So my mentor, Donald Davidson, he wrote a paper called Communication and Convention. I think it was called, is that the title of it? Communication Convention, in which he argues that you don't need shared content to communicate. And what did he have in mind? Well, he had in mind a number of different things. Let's see if I have any examples of what I said. Let's see. Yeah, so here's one. So sometimes you know the meaning of a word. You're my audience, or you're my speaker, and I don't know the meaning of the word. So I bring a package I want to mail to my friend in Shanghai from New Jersey, and I say to the guy, I'm going to mail this package. He says, let me measure that with my Koba. Now, I never heard the word Koba before. He pulls out some weird-looking instrument and wraps it around my package, and then we ship my package off. I take a guess that maybe Koba means how big it is, or how long it is, how wide it is, something to that effect, given what he did with the device in his hand once he got it. But I don't know what Koba means. So there's a sense in which we want to say it was successful communication because my package got mailed. I had an intent to mail my package, but I didn't really know what he meant by Koba when it started. I might have hypothesized as the conversation moved on that what he could have meant. But it looks as though that communication can go on in a happy way without any real problems, even though I did not know in advance what the word meant. You might say, I picked up what the word meant as the conversation moved along, but not initially. But there are even better examples. Suppose we go looking for my cousin, who mischievously I locked in my office. He was being naughty, let's suppose. I said, I'm going to lock you in the office. We get there, open the door, and he's gone. And I have no idea how he escaped. And I said, I guess he Houdini'd his way out. Now, this might be completely unfamiliar to you, but Houdini was an escape artist, very famous and popular, long before I existed, I think in the 1920s and 1930s. And when you say someone Houdini'd the way out, he was apparently very famous for his ability to escape from places that looked like they're inescapable. They would put chains around his arms, lock him up in a box, throw him in the river, and you think, okay, that's the end of him. But he would pop up somehow and get out of the thing and everything. So when you say someone who Houdini'd the way out, you mean something like he got out in a very unusual and efficient way, but you don't know how. It's sort of inexplicable to you. But of course, I didn't know that in advance because I never heard anyone. Houdini's a proper name, and there's a practice in English, at least, probably in Mandarin as well, where you can turn nouns into verbs. So when I say he Houdini'd his way out, all I had was his name, and I knew something about the person who was named Houdini, and I exploit that somehow in conveying something to you. But how that's done is certainly not based on any prior coding that we shared, because I made the word up. There's no way you could have had a prior code because the word didn't exist until I used it. Let me think of another example. Let's see. Well, you can see that we're moving very quickly towards this idea that it's possible to change the meaning of certain words or to acquire the meaning. You might infer from the data I give you so far that it's possible that sometimes people call it the dynamic theory of meaning, which is sometimes it's called the epistemic amelioration view, sometimes it's called the meaning. What's some of the other expressions that are used? What is Ludlow called?
So he calls it negotiation because he's thinking of this as micro-language negotiation.
And what are the Plunkett?
That's also what Plunkett does. Ludlow sometimes uses this term conversational crisis. People like Hasslinger talk about semantic amelioration, things like that.
So the idea is that we're presented with a word, conceptual engineering. That's sort of the main buzzword that's floating around. The idea is that we're presented with some concepts, we can improve them, make them better, make communication better by changing their meaning. Okay, so it looks like we're a step away from that with these arguments so far. So, for example, here's an example that Ludlow loves, which I'm amused by myself. Actually, before I do that one, I'll do this one. This is from Steve Schiffer in a book called Meaning. He says, so he has a partner, and the partner misuses words, right? So malapropism, as we say in English. So instead of saying erotic, she says erratic. And instead of saying erratic, she says erotic. So she uses the word erotic where you would use erratic, and she uses the word erratic where you would use erotic. Now, I know this, but in general, people don't know this, so they just confuse about what the heck she's trying to say. But you and I, let's suppose you're the person, we can have a local convention. It's not a public convention, but you and I could, you might not even participate. I might know, whatever I do today, I want to make sure I succeed in convincing her not to hire that plumber because he's very erratic. But if I say, don't hire that plumber, he's erratic, maybe she'll like that. So I got to say, well, no, I mean, he's erotic. Because if I say erotic, she'll infer erratic, which is what I want to infer. So there's a local convention, which we work on nobody else except her, and she's not participating. I'm following along her good lead. So that's an example of where I'm improving or changing the meaning of a word in order to have a successful conversation exchange. Here's one of my favorites. So you have the slide as an example. Is that up there? Take a look at that picture. Can you see the picture from where you're sitting?
Give them the example first.
Okay. So this is from Peter Ludlow's book on words. He talks about this example. He was driving home from work one day. And he used to listen to apparently radio sports. So there'd be all the, I don't know if they have it in China, but these crazy people scream and yell at each other all night long about who's a better football player, who's a better badminton player, whatever your favorite sport is. And they were doing a evaluation of the greatest athletes of the 20th century. And some guy called up and said, you didn't include Secretariat. And the guy said, that's a horse. He said, yes, but he's a great horse. He's the greatest athlete of the 20th century. You know, now, how good was he? You have the picture up there? Take a look at him winning the Belmont, what's it called, the Belmont Stakes. This is a horse racing against the best horses alive at the time. And take a look, the jockey wants to see how far ahead he is. You know, normally in a good race, you win by a nose, which means that the horse's nose crossed the finish line than the opponent's horse's nose. This guy can't even figure out who his competition, where is his competition? Like, did they disappear? Look at he looks as shocked as the opponents are. This horse won by 20 lengths, which is, this is not like a great horse against a bunch of crummy horses. This is all the champion horses that were alive at that time. So that was his argument for why, if you want to have a good use for a word, make athlete extend to non-humans as well. And these debates take place all the time. So during the Olympics, many Americans complained that, well, badminton's not a sport. And I can easily imagine it was returned by you saying that, well, neither is weightlifting. Why the hell is weightlifting a sport? There's no team, you know, or wrestling. Why is wrestling? Well, wrestling is a competition between people, something like that. So you can imagine these debates, and you can imagine you think you're improving the concept by getting clear, by clarifying what it counts to be an athlete. Is being human important? So one of the arguments against human being important was that Secretariat was really fast. Well, what about, they're much faster creatures on the planet than horses. Should we make those some of the greatest athletes of the 20th century? Is it, so you get these debates going on. What's interesting about these debates is that the participants agree on all the facts. So if you remove the question about athlete, what counts as an athlete, just like how many races did Secretariat win? How fast is Secretariat? How much faster is Secretariat than other horses? All those are facts that everybody agrees on. So it looks as though whatever being an athlete is, it doesn't supervene on these facts unless we change the meaning of athlete. So how do we do that without changing the facts? So the disagreement is not about facts, but it's about what the concept is, whether this is a conceptual argument or verbal. Are we merely suggesting that we change the meanings of the word? Because that's something that looks pretty easy to do. We say, let's introduce a new word, athlete star, let's suppose. So the target is the idea that negotiation allows for communicative success, that the resolution requires understanding how to adjust background conventions. So what happens all the time is we decide that we have a word, we can use it if we change the meaning slightly to cover more territory than it has covered so far, and we think it might be tightening. We might think you're getting at the essence of athletehood. The essence of athletehood isn't being human, it's rather having certain skills, and this horse had those skills, something to that effect. That's the received view. What we're going to argue today, I'm sorry for all you nodding your head with approval, but we're going to argue that this view is incoherent. If we're right, then a lot of arguments that are currently being run have to be either reissued or redescribed, or we're wrong. So I think I will stop there and let Una take over.
See the slides better. Okay, so the basic idea is, it's a very intuitive way to think about this problem. It seems like we have a disagreement. One party insists Secretariat is an athlete. The other party insists, no, Secretariat is not an athlete. Nobody is confused about the facts. They both know that the Secretariat is a horse. They both know how impressive a horse is, that he won Belmont Stake and all the Triple Crown and so forth. The most impressive horse you can ever imagine, how fast he was. So it's not like there's a missing information. And once we start thinking about it that way, it's very intuitive to think that, okay, we can't learn anything further, right, about Secretariat, so whether he's an athlete or not comes down to the concept or the meaning of the word athlete, right? So it's got to be that that's what we're disagreeing about. And if you think about it that way, then a resolution of a disagreement is a kind of a settlement on a particular meaning or a particular underlying concept, right? We're changing our concepts or meanings of the term. So that's very natural, but we think it's problematic, as Ernie was foreshadowing. And there are deep problems both in characterizing what exactly would be the nature of this debate, what would be the focus of this debate, if what we're after is a kind of a linguistic negotiation or conceptual negotiation. And second, we're going to show that there's kind of deep tension with this idea that we've learned from Kaplan, Burge, and Putnam, this kind of externalist tradition in philosophy of language, although we don't need externalism, we need something much weaker, namely that we can sometimes be ignorant about the meanings of our terms, but that doesn't disrupt our linguistic usage. So I'm going to go through all that and explain what I mean in a second. So first the question is, if this is a linguistic negotiation, how exactly are we going to explain, how are we going to characterize what the focus of the debate is, what this disagreement is about? And we have some choices here. They're not always separated in the literature, but we think they're conceptually distinct and they ought to be separated in the literature. So in particular, there's two ways you can think about it. If you think that this is about the meaning of the word athlete, then there's two ways to think about it. You might think that there is a single word, athlete in English, and we are now disagreeing over what that word means. And similarly for the, I don't know how you say athlete in Mandarin Chinese, but I'm sure you all know, so then the disagreement would be, what does that word mean, right? Whether it can include horses and non-human animals. Or you might think that there is a hidden ambiguity or a proposal to introduce a different word that just such happens to sound like athlete, right? So just like the English word bank is ambiguous, it can mean either financial institution or the river bank, right? So similarly, maybe athlete is tacitly ambiguous and we're disagreeing which disambiguation to take on board. So there's two ways to think about it. We think both ways are problematic, but for slightly different reasons. So let me go over that briefly, just to give you a sense of what I have in mind. So the first thought is the lexical choice thought. The word is ambiguous, or we are proposing to introduce an ambiguous word. Okay, so one way to think about it is the debate is whether to, so we have this word athlete, maybe the proposal is to introduce a new word that just sounds the same, athlete, but it has this different meaning. So assuming that the original meaning is restrictive, that it excludes non-human animals, right? The proposal from this caller who is nominating secretariat is to introduce a new word that sounds the same but has a wider meaning, right? It applies to non-human animals as well. So how about if we thought of the problem that way? The problem is, why should we, it seems like it matters that the word is still, that it sounds and it's spelled like athlete. And the question is, why should we matter about this homonym? Why does it matter what a particular word means? Why would we want to introduce a new word? What's the normative significance of this proposal? So in particular, and to kind of press this worry, suppose that I propose to resolve the debate the following way. I say, well, look, let's forget about quote-unquote athlete. Let's introduce this new word, schmathlete, and let's agree by stipulation that this word applies both to humans and non-human animals, so who are engaged in sports in the right way and so forth. Let's just make that a stipulation. And let's then all agree that Secretariat is a schmathlete and disagreement solved. So why would that, it seems like there's something deeply unsatisfying about that, right? You would want to know, well, no, I don't care about schmathletes. I want to know whether Secretariat is an athlete, right? We are compiling a list of the 100 greatest athletes of the 20th century. Who cares about whether he is a schmathlete or not? And once you see that in the case of a non-homonymous expression, an expression that doesn't sound and is not spelled like athlete, you will see that the same should apply to the homonymous expression as well. It can't be that we care about this word just because of how it sounds and what its shape is, right? That's not what we care about intuitively. Or you might think, well, maybe this word athlete plays a kind of a role in our cognitive and practical lives. And so maybe we care about that role, and that wouldn't transfer to the word schmathlete. It wouldn't transfer to this new word. But the problem is, if it wouldn't transfer to schmathlete, it wouldn't transfer to a homonym, the word that sounds exactly like it, athlete as well. Because what it is in virtue of which this word plays this normative role, well, it can't be just because of how it sounds and what it's spelled like. If we agreed that quote-unquote athlete means rocks, well, no longer would it play that role for us. It seems it would lose that role. So it seems like what makes it suitable to play this particular role is precisely that it has the meaning it has. And if you change its meaning, the non-synonymous changes would affect the role as well. Right? So such role cannot be tied to meaning by assumption because it's not preserved in non-synonyms. But it doesn't seem to be tied to any other aspect of the word, such as sound or shape and so forth. So it seems like we're left with no. So the first option is ruled out by the proponent because they're saying the meaning changes, but the role is preserved. So if the meaning changes and the role is preserved, the role can be tied to the meaning. But the second option doesn't seem satisfactory either. It can't be that it's tied to just how the word sounds, because maybe if there happened to be the word that sounds just like athlete in Mandarin Chinese, but means something completely different, it wouldn't thereby play the same role that the word athlete plays for English speakers. Yeah, that's this particular. And similarly, you can see there's a further argument here, I mean, just to pile on a bit, but it seems like this kind of misses the point of the debate. If we settle the debate for English, it doesn't seem like we just care about what this particular word means. It's not like now I would have to do the same for Mandarin word for athlete and so forth and so forth. So like, let's agree that for Secretariat is an athlete, but I don't know what's the translation of athlete into Mandarin. Now we wonder, well, whether that word also applies to Secretariat. That would be a very bizarre way to approach this debate. It seems like if we settle it for one language, we would settle it for another. So it doesn't seem to be about the word. Okay. But then you might think, well, what about this idea? What about we have the word athlete and we're disagreeing what should be its meaning? Yeah? How about that? Well, so here's the idea. The thought is negotiation and disagreement is what the word does or what it should mean. So maybe it means this restrictive thing that applies only to human animals, but maybe it should mean something wider, says the one who nominates Secretariat, right? Maybe it should be more permissive. It should allow animals in as well. And so we're kind of pushing one another around. We're trying to influence one another. We're doing this conceptual ethics or conceptual engineering, right, or lexical engineering, if you like, to improve on the meaning of the word. And then the resolution of the crisis would come in renegotiating the semantic convention so that the word comes to have a novel meaning. Maybe is that a good option? How about that? Whoops. Yeah, correct. More soft. Okay, so the problems. I say this strategy also mislocates the focus of the conversational crisis. It makes it again be about particular words of a particular language. But it seems like we don't care just about particular words of a particular language. As I said again, so this strategy would tell you we care about what this word athlete means, but what about its synonyms both in English and also across languages? So I tell you, okay, the English word athlete should include secretariat, and then you ask me, how about the Mandarin word athlete? Well, it would be a very strange way to approach this debate. It seems like it would completely miss the point. If we agree in English that secretariat is an athlete, then we should also agree, I don't know what the Mandarin is. Exactly, so that word should then also apply thereby to secretariat. We wouldn't have two separate debates, one in English and one in Mandarin, and then one in Serbian and one in Italian and so forth. That would be a very strange thing. Okay, so it doesn't seem to be about the meanings of words. Well, maybe you might think, okay, so maybe it's not about meaning of words, maybe it's about the underlying concepts. The thought would be, well, words express concepts, and what ties the synonyms together, and what ties synonyms both within the language and translations, so synonyms across languages together, is that they all express the same concept. So what connects the English word athlete and the Mandarin counterpart is that they express the same concept. And maybe we're disagreeing about either what that concept should mean, what it should be its content, or we're disagreeing about which concept the word should express, yeah, or these words all of them should express. So maybe we're trying to change the meaning of a concept. So you can't just say, well, it's about which concept the word expresses, because then again you're tied to a particular word. But maybe something about, well, what's the meaning of that concept? Maybe we're trying to do conceptual change or conceptual engineering instead, change the meaning of the underlying concept.
By the way, that's where you get closer to people like William Harvey. That's what he describes himself as trying to do.
That's right.
He's trying to get people to think of the heart as a muscle, and then things will change about circulation and so on.
That's right. So we're going to kind of a framework change, conceptual change, right? A number of people think about it that way, and this might be one of the illustrations, right? How about that proposal? What can we say about that proposal? Well, first, it does require a certain controversial view about concepts. It tells you that a concept can remain the same while its content changes. So we are not here to tell you that that's controversial. We're just going to note it. We're not going to argue against it. But we do know that there's a significant change. So what it is in virtue of which a concept remains the same while its meaning changes is a murky business, and the proponent would owe us an account of that. But setting that aside, problems remain. First, the idea is that we care about this particular concept and preserving it while we change its meaning. So it must be that we care about it for some role that it plays for us, maybe a normative or conceptual role, or some kind of inferential role or cognitive role, and so forth. But how does this concept play this role if not in virtue of its meaning? What's the role of the concept athlete that is separate from its extension in a way that it allows us to change the meaning while preserving the role? So ex hypothesis, the role cannot be in virtue of meaning, right? Because the meaning by hypothesis is supposed to change. So it has to be in virtue of some other feature of the concept. But here we seem to be in an even worse position than in the case of words, because it can be about the shape or sound or anything such, right? So it seems like we are at loss here as to what the source of this role will be, what the carrier of the role. And we just illustrate that by pressing further. So if we renegotiate the meaning of the concept athlete to now denote things like rocks, right? It seems like it would completely lose whatever role it was supposed to play for us. So it seems like renegotiate the concept marriage to denote bachelors, right? Will no longer play the same role for us because the role of the concept marriage is to allow us to think about marriage, right? Not to think about bachelors, right? So it will change. Yeah, that's the idea. Okay, so we think there's also kind of a deep problem for anybody who's going to advocate either a lexical change, a change of the meaning of the word, or conceptual change, a change of the meaning of the underlying concept, and that is that they're going to generate empirical predictions which are incorrect, right? So consider what I have on the slide here. It seems like, suppose we are in this debate whether Secretariat is an athlete, and let's say we come to agree that Secretariat is an athlete, and that's the right way to think about Secretariat. Well, the natural way to describe our scenario is with utterances like 6 and 7. After we have agreed, it seems like this would be very natural to say. I would tell you, well, we used to think that Secretariat was not an athlete, but now we think he is. Or we might say we stopped thinking that Secretariat was not an athlete. Or we might say we were wrong to think that Secretariat is not an athlete. Now we think he is. But the problem here is that if the word athlete or the concept athlete changed its meaning, then of course it's not true that we used to think that Secretariat is not an athlete with its new meaning, because by hypothesis we do think he is an athlete with its new meaning, which includes Secretariat, right? However, if this word athlete here preserves its old meaning, this again is not true, because according to the old meaning, we still don't think that Secretariat is an athlete in that meaning, because that meaning by hypothesis rules out Secretariat. So it seems like we are out of luck here. The only way to capture this is if you think that the word athlete has a constant meaning that didn't change, but our beliefs about what that meaning is actually what changed. Yeah? And same with the example.
Or you can go meta-linguistic, which is boring.
You can go meta-linguistic. We think that gets things wrong, so you might think, well, maybe what this means is something like, we used to think that the word Secretariat should apply to, the word athletes should apply to Secretariat. Now we think that is wrong. We think that there's no way to capture that, that reading other than the way that tells you that the beliefs about the word change. Because if you think about it, the way to paraphrase it is to say something like, we used to wrongly think that the word athlete applies to Secretariat, but now we think correctly that it does, right? Or that the word athlete does not apply to Secretariat, but now we think correctly that it does. That way of paraphrasing is only consistent if the meaning of the word didn't change. However, you can get her, it's not intuitive to say things like, we used to correctly think that the word athlete fails to apply to Secretariat, and now we also correctly think that it does, right? Which would be a reading you would need if the word actually changed its meaning. I'm happy to elaborate on that if there are questions after, but we don't think this is an option that is going to So that's just my way of saying, so far what I've argued is that there's no really intuitive, natural way of describing the focus of the conversational crisis of this kind of a linguistic negotiation if it is to be really about either the meaning of the word or the choice of a disambiguation of the word or the meaning of a particular underlying concept. It seems like what we care about is not what the words mean or what the concepts mean. That's not what these disagreements normatively seem to be about. Those kind of ways of describing fail to kind of target what we really are after when we're disagreeing, and that's why we get this bizarre result that the debate about Mandarin is completely separate from the debate about English, and that somehow the concepts can survive changes even though their meanings might wildly vary, right? And also we generate incorrect predictions about how we think about the progress or the resolution of this conversational crisis, as illustrated in examples 6 and 7 that I just showed a moment ago. But moreover, we think that there is a kind of a, even if you didn't buy anything I said so far, and if no, I really insist that this is about the change in meaning and the meanings of the word, that we can actively change the meanings of the words, we think you're going to run into some serious trouble with kind of a very simple but a very fundamental aspect of our linguistic practice, namely that we can have stability of meaning even when we are confused or partially informed about what those meanings are. Yeah? Let's say a little bit more about what I mean here. Okay. So, ignorance and error. So this lesson that goes back to the lessons from the work of Putnam and Kripke and Burge that tell us that certain meanings are not in the head, and also that by extension you can be ignorant about the meanings of the words, but still use those words with the meanings that they have in the linguistic community that you belong to. Yeah. So here's an example. Let's rewind our clocks back to prior to the discovery of the H2O molecule in the past, right? The 17th or 18th century, right? And before the discovery, people still were able to talk about water. So I could, in the past, have told you, I want some water, and you would have handed me a glass of water and said, here you go. But neither you nor I would know that water is H2O, nor we would be able to systematically distinguish it from an indistinguishable substance that has this chemical structure of X, Y, Z. So even though we might be in all sorts of ways confused about or ignorant about what the meaning of the word water is intuitively, we are still talking about water even regardless of that kind of widespread confusion. And notice in the past, right, the entire linguistic community was ignorant in this way because nobody knew about the H2O molecule, right? So the successful usage, we thought, is grounded not in our descriptive knowledge of the facts about the phenomenon, but something like the causal and historical connections that the utterances bear to the world, in which we're embedded, and the linguistic network that we belong to, all the way down to the initial baptism of the term. So somebody who first introduced the word water pointed at a sample of water and said, that is water, right? And from then on, this word was passed along with its meaning to other linguistic participants in the English-speaking community, and same for the Mandarin counterpart of water, where the first Mandarin speaker encountered a sample of water and went, I don't know how you say water in Mandarin, but baptized it, right? And then it spread out around the community and so forth, right? So, and that's why we can still speak about it, even though we might be ignorant about it. Similarly for other kind of phenomena, right? So I might say that I don't want to drink this particular diet soda because it has aspartame in it, or that I avoid cigarettes because they have nicotine in them, but I might not know exactly what aspartame is, other than just it being a sweetener. Maybe I'm very ignorant about chemistry and can't really tell you anything much further, how it differs from, whether aspartame is in Splenda or in Sweet and Low, I don't know, right? Similarly with nicotine, I might not know exactly which dangerous substance it is that's in cigarettes, whether it's also in pipes and what other kinds of things, right? But even so, it seems like still use it to say both true and false things about it, right? And even if I'm a speaker ignorant about water, I can say things like, I wonder whether water is H2O, or I suspect that water might not be H2O, and things like that, right? It seems like I'm not just failing to talk about water just in virtue of exhibiting my ignorance, yeah? So the lesson here, and it's a very familiar one, right, is that just the linguistic usage can be stable even if I'm an ignorant and uninformed speaker, and even if my participants in my community are equally misinformed and ignorant about the meaning, yeah? Of course, there's a trivial sense in which everybody within the community knows the meaning of the word water, so we all know, quote-unquote, water means whatever the word water means, right? But that's too thin, right? That's not going to explain how we get things done in the word. There's a sense in which I also know Mandarin, right? Because I know that the Mandarin word for water means whatever the Mandarin word for water means, but that will not allow me to speak to you in Mandarin, right? And so it seems like that's not a useful way of knowing the meaning, right? So something something, and I can't negotiate with you about the meaning of the Mandarin purge water if all I know about it is just that it means whatever it means, right? That's two things, right? Okay, so how does this bear on our problem? Well, here is a very quick, and I admit that this is too quick, but I'm going to embellish it and make it less quick in just a second, but just to give you a sense, right? Here is a quick argument against the meaning negotiation and meaning change. So the meaning of the word quote-unquote athlete is equally grounded in the causal historical social networks that bring you back to the original baptism of the coining of this word with its meaning. We know that speakers can be ignorant in various ways about the meanings of the term. So just as they can be ignorant about the meaning of the term water, similarly they can be ignorant about the meaning of the term quote-unquote athlete. That doesn't disrupt linguistic usage. And so thereby, when I talk about athletehood, when I use the word athlete, I'm using it with whatever meaning it has, going back to the baptism, regardless of whether I'm misinformed. So what our disagreement shows is that at least one of us is confused about the meaning of the word water, or the meaning of the word athlete, right? But it doesn't tell us who is confused, and since we know that the linguistic usage is stable in the mouth of the speakers, even though they might be confused, that we come to agree one way or another is going to be ineffective as to what the actual meaning is. Just as if we all agreed that water means whiskey, that wouldn't change the meaning of the word water. So suppose we are confused in the same way. I want to ask for the glass of whiskey from Ernie, but I think that water means whiskey, so I tell you, give me a glass of water. Luckily, Ernie seems to be confused the same way. He thinks that water means whiskey, so he hands me a glass of whiskey, and I drink it, and we are very happy, thinking that the word water means whiskey. But you still all know that that's not true, right? That this is a confusion on our part, that we're linguistically misinformed. So similarly here, if we agree that Secretariat is an athlete, even if we do so, if it's a matter of fact that's linguistically misinformed, our disagreement is going to have no effect on the meaning of the word. Yeah? That's it. Okay, that's a quick argument. Arguably too quick, but let's push a bit further. Let's see how we can establish it. Yeah? So you're going to think, okay, so maybe what's happening is that even though our beliefs are not automatically effective in changing the meanings of the word, what's really going on here is that when I'm using the word athlete in a way that might be non-standard from the perspective of the linguistic community, maybe I'm doing so for a kind of a rhetorical purpose. I'm kind of pragmatically implying that the word should be used a different way in accordance to how I believe it should be applied. So when I say Secretariat is an athlete, I'm signaling that I believe that the correct usage of the word athlete is the one that applies to Secretariat, and I'm kind of implicitly also inviting you to go along with this as well. And maybe then if we start coordinating, that will be either a coining of a new word or a changing meaning of this whole word. If like the entire linguistic community came to agree with me that maybe this is a better practice, well, maybe that would be effective. Maybe that would change the meaning of the word or coin another word. So there's two ways again to think about it. Either it's a pragmatic proposal that a word should be introduced in accord with this use that I'm exhibiting as an ambiguity proposal, right? A novel word that sounds like athlete, but it is the way I'm using it, right? Or maybe we want to change the meaning of the existing word athlete, but in accordance with my usage, how I'm using it, yeah? That might be another way. So if the idea is that when I say Secretariat is an athlete, I'm signaling that a new term should be introduced in accordance with my usage, where the meaning of the term applies to Secretariat. The question is, how exactly does it do so? How is it that when I say this, by assumption posting that Secretariat is an athlete, that I thereby signal that you should introduce a novel word? It can't be pragmatic, right? In the kind of a Gricean sense, because typically speakers don't really intend to use the term in a false way. When the guy called in on the radio show and said, how about Secretariat? Secretariat is an athlete. It's not like he had an intention or or she, I don't know who called, right, in this story, that they had an intention to use the term non-standardly. It's just that they actually thought that the word is standardly used in this way, that it also applies to secretariat. So thereby, if there's no intention to introduce a new word, you can't also be pragmatically implying that a new word should be introduced, because typically, at least in the tradition going back to Christ, the idea is that if you're pragmatically implicating something, you have to intend to convey it to the new audience. But even if you were not impressed by that kind of argument, or even if we stipulated the speaker was intending to implicate that a new term should be introduced, there is a really deep problem here, namely how exactly will we go about introducing this new term? And that's a really deep problem, right? Why? Well, so by assumption, our disagreement reveals that at least one of us is confused about the meaning. So what exactly the standard meaning of the word athlete is not a common knowledge among our audience, among the interlocutors, because at least one of the interlocutors fails to know what the meaning is, right? And in fact, because there is a disagreement, it seems like neither really has knowledge as to what the meaning is. Yeah? But if we're going to negotiate to introduce a word that just like the original, that has exactly the same meaning like the original word, except that it also includes secretariat, we have to be able to have that starting point, what the original meaning is, in order to argue from there to this new meaning. And it seems like that's exactly the same. So that seems like a deep problem with the starting point. And there's also a deep problem with the ending point. So let's suppose that we even give the speaker the original meaning. Let's say is the meaning that excludes secretariat and so forth, and we want to introduce the meaning that's just like it, but it applies to secretariat. The problem is that there's indefinitely many candidate meanings that satisfy that criterion. Secretariat or athlete, horse or athlete, animal or athlete, and so forth. And even if we restrict ourselves to the more natural candidate, even there, you're going to have indefinitely many ways of filling this out. Yeah? So even if secretariat, so you might think, let's suppose we actually can, even if secretariat is not an athlete, we should have a word like quote-unquote athlete that applies to secretariat as well. Let's suppose we want to implement this. The problem is, even if we mutually agree that we want to act on 10, right? We can't really do that because we don't know what the meaning is that's like the meaning of the original word athlete, but that it applies to secretariat. There's indefinitely many candidates, even if we knew the starting point, and the disagreement reveals that we don't know the starting point, right? So we're kind of at sea, right? That's just what the ignorance and narratives do. Okay. I should ask, how am I doing for time? How long should I speak for?
Yes, you still have 20 minutes.
Okay, good. Just make sure.
About an hour.
Excellent, yeah. All right. So the similar, so you can already see that the analogous problem is going to arise if what you thought is that you're signaling pragmatically somehow that we should change the meaning of this word, right? Not introduce a new word that has a similar meaning, but create a similar meaning for the existing word, right? It's going to be exactly the same problem. So typically, speakers are not going to enter the debate having an intention to use the word non-standardly, right? And even if they, thereby they're not implicating that the meaning, that we should change the meaning of the word, right? Because to implicate that, you have to intend to be proposing that the meaning of the word should change, and typically speakers are not going to have that intention. Arguably in the original case, where the caller goes into the radio show, right? They don't do so as a kind of a linguistic activist. They just do so because they think secretariat is an athlete, right? Further, you can see how that implicature is not going to be calculable. So just by the very fact that you don't know whether you're proposing to introduce a new word or to change the meaning of the existing word tells you that neither of the two proposals are going to be calculable on the basis of the starting point of what I said, right? And finally, even if you thought that the speaker intends the relevant thing, we're again going to be at loss as to what the change has to be. Okay, let's look at that. Oops. So let's suppose now 11 is what the proposed changes, right? So we say, let's agree on this much. Even if secretariat is not an athlete, the word quote-unquote athlete should apply to secretariat as well. And let's say that I convince you of this, right? And we agree, and we want to change the meaning of the word athlete accordingly. Again, we seem at loss how to start and how to end, right? So the starting point is problematic because our disagreements show that at most one of us was correct about the meaning, possibly both of us have been wrong, right? So what exactly the original meaning was is something that's not common knowledge among the interlocutors, but that's needed as a starting point because that's the thing we're supposed to change just so slightly so that it now applies to secretariat as well. So since we don't know where to start, it's not clear how we're going to change it to begin with. Second, even if we knew where the starting point is, we don't know what the ending point is supposed to be like, right? It's, again, indefinite. There are indefinitely many candidates to choose from, right? There's indefinitely many meanings that are alike the original meaning of secretariat, of athlete, right? But it applies to secretariat as well, regardless of what the original meaning is. So athlete or course, athlete or secretariat, athlete or the winner of the Belmont Stake, athlete or the winner of the Triple Crown, and so forth and so forth. And even if you restrict yourselves to the so-called natural meanings, right, the ones that are not gerrymandered in this kind of disjunctive way, you're still going to see that there's indefinitely many candidates to choose from, right? So we still have a problem. Okay. Okay, so one thing that you might have had lingering in the back of your mind as I was speaking is that I spoke so far as if meanings are fully determinate, so that they kind of separate neatly into extension and anti-extension, right? But what about if meanings are instead underspecified? They don't fully determine their extension, but rather have only partial determination that needs to be fleshed out in the context so that the utterance has a truth value. What do I mean by that, right? So maybe the thought is that athlete, quote unquote, has an underspecified content. That that the semantic conventions that we endorse in the back of our linguistic practice don't fully determine what sorts of things fall under athlete. It only determines maybe some core cases, right? Maybe, it determines that, I don't know, would be a paradigm case that Shaquille O'Neal is an athlete, but it doesn't tell you anything about secretariat or forces and so forth. They're just silent on that issue. And when I utter secretariat as an athlete in a context, we have to negotiate the contextual standards in a way that's going to reduce the underspecificity just so that my utterance has a truth value, either true or false, right? And when we clash, we're disagreeing as to how to resolve that boundary, where to set the boundary of this underspecified meaning in this particular context, yeah? So the idea is negotiation is about controlling underspecification, reducing underspecification, either by narrowing the application of a term or sharpening the boundaries of a term, reducing the vagueness of a term, right? How many numbers of hairs you have to have in order not to be bold and so forth, right? A number of people in this debate think of meanings as underspecified. So maybe I was unfair by kind of talking as if meanings were specific. Maybe that's what we were implicitly assuming here, that our opponents would not be happy with, yeah? Well, the problem is that what goes for specific meaning goes for underspecified as well. The first thing to observe is that even if meanings are underspecified, this underspecificity, the standing conventions have to be strong enough so that not anything goes, right? We're not it's not at our freedom to renegotiate the meaning of our words in whichever way we like, right? There are certain things that have to be ruled out by the standing convention. So, in particular, we can't negotiate the word. It wouldn't be a natural negotiation if we were negotiating the term quote unquote athlete means sports person or a rock, right? And so now I start using the word athlete to denote rocks. We can agree to do that, but then implicitly we would have introduced a completely new term that has nothing to do with our previous debate, right? It would not have any continuity with whatever it is that we talked about earlier, right? So if the standing meanings are underdetermined, the underdetermination has to be controlled in a way that tells us what kind of narrowing, what kind of specifications are allowed and what ones are not allowed. So the standing meaning has to be robust enough to rule out things like sports person or rock, right? But if it's robust enough, right, then the ignorance and error is going to kick in again. So let me just illustrate a bit more concretely what I have in mind. So in particular, if we want to reduce underspecification, we must start with whatever is the actual underspecified content, and then work with that to narrow the underspecification ever so slightly so that it now applies to secretariat. But the problem is that you can equally be ignorant about the underspecified core meaning as much as you can be ignorant about the specific meanings. So in particular, we might agree that, it might be that the underspecified core rules out chess players, but then I believe that it doesn't, right? So it's true that it applies to Shaquille O'Neal, but I also think that it applies to, Alekhine, right? But in fact, it doesn't, right? It rules him out of the fight or something like that. So in that case, I would be ignorant about the underspecified meaning of the word athlete, right? But if so, then our disagreement again reveals that at most one of us might be correct about the meaning, right? And it's not clear what underspecified meaning to start from in order to renegotiate it's ever so slightly so that it now applies to secretariat. So let's suppose that I believe that the word athlete does not apply to chess players, and I'm wrong, and Early believes that the word athlete does apply to chess players, and he's right. But now we're not disagreeing about chess players, we are disagreeing about secretariat. So now we agree that secretariat is an athlete. So now the idea is we narrow down the underspecification of the core meaning in a way that allows for secretariat, but we already disagree about what the core meaning is. So how are we going to use that to narrow down the meaning of the word secretariat? It's not clear, right? And further, again, you have you have indefinitely many options at the end point as well, right? Even if we know what the core meaning is, how exactly we are going to change it so that we apply the secretariat is again underspecified. There's indefinitely many options, right? We can change it so that it allows for horses, or maybe all four-legged animals, or maybe birds as well, or maybe winners of the Triple Crown, and so forth and so forth, right? There's indefinitely many options. So the point of the argument being that what goes for specific meanings applies to underspecified meanings equally. Yeah, there's no getting around here. Okay. But then what about the shared contents of lexical innovation? If you remember when Ernest started to talk, he said, well, look, sometimes we do have lexical innovation. We seem to be able to use the words with their meanings prior to knowing the linguistic conventions, and sometimes even without there being any prior linguistic conventions. So that's the case of Houdini or Kova, right, where you introduce a word on the fly or learn the word for the first time, but nevertheless it seems like it is successful in communication. So how is it that we can kind of cook up new conventions if we can't change them once they're in place, right? How is it that we can create new meaning conventions but can't renegotiate them, as we have been arguing that you can't renegotiate? How is that possible? Okay, so let's look at that. So recall the example we started with. You get to a post office and the clerk says, let me measure your package with a kova. You have never heard the word kova before, but the clerk is holding a weird shaped device and he's about to measure the package, so you assume this is the device that is used to measure the volume of the package, let's say. Does this show that the agents can coordinate on meanings on the fly? Because in this case, the hearer doesn't know the meaning, but coordinates with the speaker on the fly and gets the meaning on the fly. So why is that not sufficient? Why does that not give us enough knowledge so that my arguments for ignorance and error, there are arguments for ignorance and error are blocked, right? Why is that not sufficient? Well, the idea is, okay, you can get initiated into a network even though the speaker who initiates you might be confused, and even though you might still have a very partial knowledge of what the meaning is. So once you're exposed to the word COBA, you can now already use it, even though you might not be exactly sure what this device is. So you might say things like, what is a COBA? You're not sure whether it's this device, so let's suppose that this clerk is holding two devices and says, I'm going to measure your packet with a COBA, and you don't know whether it's this ruler-like thing or this, like, I don't know, scale-like thing that he's holding, right? And you ask, well, what is a COBA? It seems like you're using the word even though you don't yet know its meaning, right? Or similarly, how does a COBA work, you might ask, or whether is a COBA always shaped like a ruler and things like that, yeah? So they can do so without any specific hypothesis about what COBA is, and indeed they can do so even if the original speaker might have been confused. So interlocutor's understanding can diverge in many ways regarding what COBA measures, whether it must be all this shape and so forth. The speaker and the hearer both can be ignorant in ever so many ways, but so long as they're embedded within the network in the right way and trading this one particular word with its meaning, that's sufficient for them to be using that word with that meaning. And what they can then do is they can align their theories about what the meaning is, even though that's in fact ineffectual as to what in changing the underlying meaning. Yeah, it's not going to have an effect on what is said, and just what they believe that are approximately conventions. Similarly with the erotic case. Remember, one of the partners is confused about the meaning of the word. They confuse the words erotic and erotic. So when they mean erotic, they say erotic, and when they mean erotic, they say erotic. And here exploits this assumption that Mrs. Malver believes that erotic means whatever the English word erotic means, if anything. But it still allows, and so you might think, well, are they coordinating on the fly? When the hearer says, don't hire that plumber, he's erotic, isn't it that they are now coordinating with Mrs. Malaprop on the meaning of the word erotic, which is just like the meaning of the word erotic, right? Isn't that coordination on the fly? But the thought is that type of coordination still allows them both to be confused in all sorts of ways as to what it means to be, what the word erotic means, right? What they are doing is that the partner, Mr. Malaprop, is simply piggybacking on the fact that Ms. Malaprop believes that the one word means what the other word means, right? And so they know that when they want to use the meaning erotic, erotic, right, they should use the word erotic. But that allows them to still be confused and only partially informed about what either of these two words mean, and same for Mrs. Malaprop. In fact, they could both be wrong about the meaning of both of these words, and how to classify things into erotic things and non-erotic things, and erotic things and non-erotic things. Okay, both could be misapplying or misunderstanding both of those. Further, what about neologizing? Remember, we can coin words on the fly. So isn't that a case where we introduce a new meaning? And how is it that we can introduce a new meaning even though we've argued you can't change the new meaning? So how is it that in the case of Houdining, you are able to coordinate in such a way that now we understand what this new meaning is, even though there weren't any prior conventions? How is it not getting around our problems of the ignorance snare? Aren't there, after all, indefinitely many possibilities for what this word Houdini could mean? How are we settling on a particular one? Well, indeed, the idea is there are indefinitely many hypotheses, but the thought is, okay, we're witnessing one particular phenomenon, and we want to coordinate on that one, and so we name it, right? We say Houdini, and since we witness this, we want to talk about this particular phenomenon. But still, that allows us to be in indefinitely many ways confused about what exactly the nature of the phenomenon that we witnessed is, right? We might in future discover that we disagree whether some future instance is an instance of Houdini or not, right? What type of escape it has to be, from what types of enclosures and so forth. All of these things are still up for grabs. We might not exactly know. Just as when we first saw the sample of water, right, and said, let's call this water, and then we started talking about it, it was up for grabs exactly what water is. We didn't really know. We had to discover that further. We could have wondered, when we see a block of ice, is this water as well? Or when we see evaporation, is that water as well, and so forth. And we might imagine a disagreement, somebody bringing a block of ice and saying, this is water too. And you're saying, no, look, this is solid. Water is liquid. It can't be water, right? You might think that there could have been disagreement of this sort as well, right? So future disagreements might arise in uncovering the underlying disagreements about the meaning, but it doesn't mean that the meaning wasn't fixed when the word was coined and that it wasn't propelled through the linguistic community accordingly. What about neologizing? The thought is, if neologizing is successful, a content will be fixed, but there's no guarantee that the speakers are going to have joint grasp of meaning in any substantive sense. What they know is that to Houdini means whatever it means, that maybe that it denotes the phenomenon that they witness, but that's it. What the nature of that phenomenon is, how it extends to further cases, in which ways that might still be up for grabs. And when in future cases they litigate, they disagree and they sort of negotiate as to how to classify things into, say, Houdining and non-Houdining. They are basically doing an inquiry into this underlying phenomenon that they name, rather than changing the meaning of the word. The divergences revealed in future conversational crises are not the divergences that are going to be effective as to the meaning of the word. They're just the ones that are effective as to the underlying beliefs about the phenomenon we are talking about.
Yeah.
So the meaning of quote-unquote athlete remains constant in a similar way through the evolution of our understanding of the underlying phenomenon, aptitude. This understanding can diverge from what the original neologizer might have had in mind. And it can also diverge from the actual content. We could be confused, right? Conversational crisis can drive and affect such evolution of our understanding, either further or backwards. There's no promise that it's linear, right? Just as if Ernie and I agree that water denotes whiskey, you know, he and I might be equally confused, and you might recognize that we are confused, but our disagreement, our crisis has led us away from the actual meaning, right, not towards it, right? So there's no guarantee that this is going to be linear, but what the conversational crisis is doing is probing our understanding of the underlying phenomenon in the world, not the meanings of the term. We approach this crisis through what Plato has called the litigation, or a kind of public reasoning, right? We give reasons for and against. And notice that that's different from what we do when we discover that we use words a wrong way. So if you reveal to Mrs. Malaprop that she's confusing the two words, it will be very bizarre of her to now litigate, to give reasons as to why the plumber should count as erotic and so forth, and why erotic should be used in this way that it actually means erotic. That will be a very bizarre reaction. Whereas when we are having a disagreement about the underlying phenomena, litigation is exactly called for. Yeah, it's exactly that type of a thing we would do. We would offer analogies to court cases. We would point to important properties and distinctions and so forth. It's exactly what you wouldn't do if you were disagreeing about the meaning of the word. Yeah. Okay, conclusion. So we've argued that meanings are non-negotiable, contrary to what might seem intuitive at first, and what many people have argued. You can't actively negotiate or change existing semantic conventions. It's not within our capacity as linguistic, as participants in the linguistic community. So there's no such thing as metalinguistic reinterpretation of our terms, either understanding conversational crisis as a matter of disambiguation or meaning change or reduction of underspecification. None of these options plausibly models what's at stake in those conversational crises and what we care about when we confront such conversational crises. So it mislocates the focus of the phenomenon. Further, we have argued that this idea that you can renegotiate meanings on the fly in a way that kind of reflects the underlying beliefs or theories about what those meanings are, is in tension with the stability of linguistic usage in the face of ignorance and error. And we argue that's a significant cost, right? So, in fact, you wouldn't know where to start from, and you wouldn't know how to end this process, right? And the moral is that conversational crises highlight not differences in meaning between different speakers, right? But rather in our underlying understanding of the phenomena in the world we're talking about. We disagree over the phenomena, not the meaning, contrary to appearances. But when Ernest started to talk, he said, well, look, how is it that we could be disagreeing about the phenomenon? After all, wasn't it the case that in the Secretariat case, we knew all the underlying facts. We all know Secretariat is a horse, how far Secretariat is, that he won the Triple Crown and the Belmont Stake and so forth, and that he was the most impressive horse ever. There's nothing else to learn. What is it that we're missing? And the answer is kind of obvious, but in a way surprising one. Of course, what we're missing is whether Secretariat is an athlete or not, right? We're missing facts about this property of athletehood. That's a thing about the phenomenon in the world, not about the meaning or the concept athletehood, right? And such inquiry then is what we're engaged in, and when we're engaged in conversational crisis, is an inquiry into this underlying phenomenon. Here, the case of athletehood, right? And it's not a process of changing or constructing meaning, it's a process of changing and constructing theories of the underlying facts. Okay, and this is where I'm going to stop, so we have some time for discussion.